Hello and welcome back. We are going to talk about chapter 16 today, the classical and medieval West. We're going to talk about ancient Greece. In this culture, they regard humankind as the closest thing to perfection in physical form. Some of the qualities that are found within Greek culture is this power to reason, something that is quite unique to this culture is as well is that gods have human weaknesses. They are also known to place a very strong importance of the individual. So when it comes to ancient Greece, you can first say that it is probably one of the most influential cultures whenever people think about things like democracy. A lot of it actually is inspired by what was learned from this culture, from ancient Greece. Whenever it comes to this culture, we think about Greek mythology. We think about the different deities that they have in their culture. And so, if you can recall the gods like Zeus or Poseidon, they tend to have human weaknesses, and that's what makes them different from a lot of other cultures where, for the most part, God is perfect. But in ancient Greece, they are more of a polytheistic culture in that they are a little bit closer to being human. We're going to talk about three different stages when it comes to ancient Greek art. The first stage is known as the archaic stage. In this stage, painters are better known than sculptors. You can say that painters were regarded highly. They were looked at as the artists in the community. If you were making anything else outside of painting, if you were doing sculpture, if you were doing print making, you weren't regarded as an artist. And so painters were very highly regarded during this archaic stage in Greece. And this is the first example we're going to look at here, the Euphronos crater, made in 515 BCE, made from terracotta, the height of about 18 inches. And if you look closely at some of the images on this vessel here, it's actually a vessel used for ceremonial drinking. We see some very intricate geometric patterns, some interesting organic patterns as well. We see a central figure wearing a hat with wings on him. Maybe you are familiar with Greek mythology. You will recognize this god. Okay? And this is I believe it is the messenger god Hermes. He is responsible for being a messenger god. Very strong depictions of human form and musculature. A very active scene where you can see soldiers that have wings and that they are carrying this very large figure. These are actually scenes from the Homer Iliad, very popular epic poem that came from ancient Greece. So you can see the sides, the edges, those are referred to as the handles of the vessel. So they probably had to carry it with more than one person. So something that we might find interesting about humankind in general is we often celebrate through things like drinking. And so you can probably guess this was probably uh, containing a type of drink. And now let's take a look at another work of art, also from ancient Greece. And when you look at this, I am wondering what comes into mind. First of all, it looks very ancient Egyptian, just from the way the figure stands. We talked a little bit about the static style that was known to be in Egypt, where the left foot is slightly stepping forward and that the arms are straight down on the sides, and that this pose was actually reserved for pharaohs. And so we're looking at this figure and we are thinking, it doesn't exactly look like a pharaoh because he's not wearing a cobra headdress. So this might be someone else, but with evidence like this, we can say that a lot of work in ancient Greece was very much inspired by ancient Egypt. And so this work here, simply called Koros, 580 BCE, made from marble, about 76 inches tall. So a little bit larger than life. And so what people are saying about this sculpture is that these were more like individual achievements and not something as grand as being a king or a pharaoh. So something that they often honor in ancient Greece are these individual achievements. So this looks like a type of individual achievement statue. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the second stage of classical Greek art. And this is called the classical stage. The first stage is called the archaic stage. The second stage is called the classical stage. It is when art emphasizes rational simplicity, order, and restrained emotion. So let's take a look at this example here. Very different from work that came from the archaic stage. What are the first responses you may have when you look at this sculpture? First of all, you could say, wow, it is very anatomical, it's very accurate, it's very lifelike. And if we look at the figure himself, it's very muscular, very tall. And one thing I'm going to ask for you to remember for the quiz or the exam is, what makes the archaic stage different from the classical stage, and so on. And so this work here, Polykleitos of Argos, spear bearer, or Dorophoros, made in the 5th century. This is actually a Roman copy of the Greek original. Something about Polykleitos or the Dorophoros statue, the sculpture is standing in a contrapposto pose, which also means counterpoised or a pose of rest. So if you can imagine, if you are standing up, people have a natural tendency to lean towards one side over the other. So if you stand up, you'll notice that you're not going to stand up with your feet equally balanced and that you are standing straight without any discomfort. So you can stand straight, of course, but if you do that for a long time, you'll probably start feeling cramped. So what people do is they naturally lean more towards one side over the other. And so if you lean more towards your right side or more towards your left side, you're doing this type of contrapposto pose while you're standing up, because it counterbalances the weight from your foot to the rest of your body. It's a little bit more comfortable than just standing straight all the time. And if you can imagine back then, if you were to do a sculpture or even a painting, you need a model to actually be standing there for a long time so that you can try to copy the form. So they had to find a way to make it a little bit more comfortable for them. And so, yes, this style that came from ancient Greece is very influential. This contrapposto pose is something that they still do in artworks of today. And now, let's look at another work that came from the classical period. Remember that I'm going to ask for you to remember which period these works come from. And so this work here is called the Parthenon, a very large architecture. You can imagine how it might look during its prime. So when we look at the Parthenon, maybe some of you can recall something that you might be already familiar with. If you are thinking Washington, D.C., then you are probably on the right trail. This looks exactly like something that you've seen in the nation's capital. If you are thinking of the Lincoln Memorial, that's a very good guess. And so you could ask yourself, why or how is it possible that the architecture here resembles the architecture in ancient Greece? Something about the Parthenon, it was built as a gift to Athena. It is built in the post and lintel construction. So if you can recall a little bit about the sculpture chapter, the post and lintel or the post and beam structure is basically two upright pillars and one horizontal beam. And so instead of this having two vertical pillars, instead you have multiple pillars. Something that we can't really see from this perspective is a lot of intricate designs on the upper section, and there's smaller sculptures of mythological creatures like lapiths and centaurs. And so on this PowerPoint, it mentions these metopes. The metopes are the section around the roof, up above the pillar and the capital. So there's that triangular area on the roof. That is the metopes. Now we're going to talk about the Venus de Medici, or the Medici Venus, made in 3rd century BCE, made out of marble, about 5 feet tall. When we are looking at artwork from this classical Greek period, again, we are looking at more accurate anatomy. We are looking at clarity. We can say that some of them are leaning towards sensuality. And so some of you may know who Venus is, the goddess of love in Greek mythology. And you can see on her feet, around her feet area, we have a little baby riding a dolphin. And that is supposed to be Cupid, the son of Venus. And so we talked about the archaic Greek stage, we talked about the classical Greek stage, and now we're going to talk about the Hellenistic. So the Hellenistic stage is the third stage, and there's a date here from 323 BCE to about 30 BCE. This is when Athens started to decline as a city-state, so their main capital wasn't as powerful as it was in the past. So many things were changing in ancient Greece in the time. And so it was a reflection, there was a reflection of this idea through their art, which is they started to create artwork that heightened emotion. And so you're probably wondering what that means. If you can recall some of the statues that we looked at previously, even though they were engaged in different poses, they feel very naturalistic. They're not really doing anything that exaggerated. It's actually quite subtle. Something about Hellenistic art is they were more practical, they were less idealistic from the rest of Greek art, especially during the classical. So during the classical period, a lot of artwork were more idealized. In other words, they strive for perfection. But during the Hellenistic period, it wasn't as idealistic. They started to become a little bit more practical, a little bit more mundane. So here is the first example of a sculpture coming from the Hellenistic period. And right away, we are noticing some very striking differences. Yet at the same time, similarities remain, such as the sense of idealism, in that the figures here are quite muscular, they're tall. But if you look at the way they are engaged, if you look at the poses that they are in, very different from the classical period. Hellenistic period was all about emotion, heightened emotion. And so the main center, the point of focus, the man has his face somewhat twisted. He looks like he is in pain. He looks like he is feeling agony. We are looking at these serpents that are wrapping around him. If you look at the boys, they are also portrayed in a very twisted, a very exaggerated manner. They're leaning back, almost falling down, or they're leaning forward. Their knee is bent up in a very high position. So Hellenistic period was very different from the classical period. This is the time of Greek art when they were trying to show more emotion. And this work here is called the Laocoon group, Laocoon and his sons. Something that you'll notice, there's a bit of hierarchic scale happening. If you can recall that, we learned hierarchic scale during ancient Egypt. This idea that the figures that are portrayed larger are a little bit more important than the figures that aren't as large. And so the father figure in the center, Laocoon, is a lot larger than his sons here. And so what is the story behind this piece? Well, It comes from the Homer Iliad epic, and if you have ever heard of the Trojan War, you might be familiar with this. So Laocoon was actually a priest. He was a priest that somehow received a divine message telling the Trojans not to accept a gift from ancient Rome. And so the Romans sent them a gift, and this gift was actually a type of trap that they used to enter the Trojans' main fortress. And so what Laocoon did was was before this happened, he actually warned his country. He warned his people that this was going to happen if you were to accept a gift from them. And because of that, he was actually condemned by the Trojans in that, oh, you are saying we are going to fail, you are going to you're expecting us to lose this war that we have against our enemies, and so they basically took him away from his sons. And that's what this represents here. And so the ambush eventually does happen, and in the moment, from what people are saying, is one of the sons died and the other one, they weren't really sure what happened to him. And you can see that in the sculpture, that it appears that one of the sons is fatally wounded while the other not so. It's not as clear. And Laocoon dies in the invasion, of course. Okay, another example of work from the Hellenistic period, the portrait of an old man in Italy, 25 BCE, made from marble. Something about this work, a high degree of individuality. There are recorded imperfections that give the figure character. So what do we mean by this? We would often see idealized pictures from the classical or even the archaic periods. In other words, they try to make the people appear perfect. So when it comes to the Hellenistic period, they're moving away from this idea. So the people who are elderly, they would appear elderly in their portraits. They wouldn't appear young and idealized. Instead, they will be portrayed more naturally. Something that they did in Italy was if you were to honor your family member, what these people would do was they would carry around a sculpture of them. So if there's someone that you honor in your family, maybe a grandparent, and if they pass away, you would commemorate them by walking around with a sculpture, or in more recent times, a painting or even a photograph. So very interesting ritual, or very interesting trend that was often done in that culture. Another work that came from the Hellenistic period was this magnificent sculpture, architecture here, the Colosseum. Sorry, I can't talk right anymore. And so the famous Colosseum, if you are familiar with any Bruce Lee movies, you might have seen this. The Colosseum, very early type of stadium architecture. It was meant to have amusements such as gladiator matches, game hunts. It would even have things like theater. Some of the great achievements were met during the building of this architecture, such as engineering or town planning. You'll notice that the design is actually a colonnade. So you're looking at these series of arches. So if you see an arch at right next to another arch, and then that is next to another arch, so this ongoing series of arches, we call that a colonnade. Okay. Another great architecture that came from the Hellenistic period is this here. And this work is called the Pantheon. So the Pantheon is one of the grand architectures made in ancient Greece. And if you look at it and you compare it to something that looks familiar in the United States, you can probably say that it looks like something that you've seen around the White House. And so again, we like to ask ourselves, why does it look so familiar? Well, basically, the architects are being are they are being influenced by ancient Greece. You could say that ancient Greece brought democracy. So in the United States, we like to recognize that and say, this is what influenced our country. So we do things like mimic their architectural style. Some things that is being mentioned here: single entrance framed by column porch, that is called a portico. There are recessed squares called coffers. There's also this oculus at the top. And you can see the dome structure on the very top is actually a cavity space where you can see the sky. And this is what it looks like from the inside. This is actually a painting of what it looks like from the inside. Giovanni Paolo Panini, the interior of the Pantheon, made in 1734, even though the architecture itself was built much earlier than that. Something about ancient Rome is there are some paintings that show the love of luxury. So whenever it comes to ancient Greece or ancient Rome, we can think about their artwork and recall more sculptures than anything else. And one of the reasons why is most of the paintings that came from that period are no longer around. They deteriorate through time, or they just fade because the pigments are not they're not as strong as the more current ones. And so here is one of the few paintings that came from this period. And not too many of these works can survive. So you can see that they painted this on a wall. You can see the cracks on the wall. There's this depiction of depth and space rendered here. You could say that the form isn't exactly there. The perspective feels somewhat skewed. If you can recall some of the things that we talked about in the elements of design, we talked about space, that we can use something like a 1-point perspective or a 2-point perspective. And this work here is actually multiple perspectives, because there doesn't seem to have one vanishing point. But at the same time, you could say that it doesn't exactly look accurate in terms of what we are looking at, but still fairly representational. It gives us a great idea of what it might look like to live in the city back then. And so this is a Roman painting, survived from Pompeii. Okay? Maybe some of you recognize the city. Pompeii is a long lost city that was destroyed by a volcano. So this is one of the few surviving artifacts from that event. Okay, so I'm going to pause it here. This will be the end of part 1.